Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 21. And instead of having a guest with me this week, I just wanted to spend some time talking to the issue of the impact of sexual assault. Over the last several weeks, I've had some pretty intense interviews with guests who've been through some very harrowing and difficult trauma. And after hearing of those types of stories almost back to back, I want to take a moment to address how prevalent these cases are and acknowledge to my audience who are victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault that I know you're listening. I know you're out there and looking for answers to some very confusing and overwhelming thoughts and memories. I also know that in some cases you're still in the thick of trauma. Others of you are in the intense process of just starting your healing journey, and still others of you are on that survival path but struggling day in and day out to maintain the search for just the right recovery path and tactics. I hope you've found some of those answers in listening to my guests who've been through their own crippling traumas. I bring these victims and survivors to this platform to offer hope. But as you know, there is no hope without some sort of education and some movement on your part to push towards healing. So in this episode, I want to give you some information that will move you toward learning more and providing you with a sense of relief for some of the questions that may be playing over and over in your mind with regard to trauma memories. I'm going to give you some of the bare basics of how memory works and specifically what's happening in your brain when it comes to trauma and memory. First, let's talk a little bit about the impact of rape and sexual assault on humans. We all experience rape or sexual assault trauma in different ways, but with a similar base of experience. And that base is that we're all humans with brains that sense physical input, and we all have brains that have emotional responses to those physical inputs. The assault experience is remembered in fragments, but it's also infused or permeated with intense emotion and recollections of sensations, physical sensations such as taste and smells and sounds, touches, sights. One of those sensations is also body positions. We remember those pretty intensely also in an assault situation. And some victims may become haunted by these feelings and the senses that they know they're related to the trauma, but they have difficulty identifying the source of the feeling or the sensation. And that's just part of the impact. Not being able to identify that source is a hallmark of trauma. So let's talk a little bit about the memories and why some of them are so intense and why some of them aren't quite as intense and some memories may even not be there. I'm going to break down memory into a very, very basic way of thinking about it. Think about memory as three basic parts. And those three parts can then be further broken down into two separate components. The first part of memory is sensing. So to form a memory to begin with, you have to sense something. External senses, which are what we just talked about, sights, smells, sounds, taste, touch. And then there's actually a sixth sense, which is body position. And the other way we sense things is internally, and that's our emotion. And every sensation has an emotion attached to it. Every external sense, every memory is built on those external and internal emotional aspects. You can't have a memory that doesn't have emotion attached to it. The second part of memory is processing. So you take the sensing of external and internal input, and that is then processed through two aspects. The first being perceiving or perception, and the second is the storage process. So we'll talk about perception first. Perception is based on the way we're brought up, the way we're educated, our personality, what we ate 10 minutes before we perceived something. There's different types of inputs to the perception process. You have to realize that when we perceive something, that is individual. That's where the cliche comes from, that my perception is my reality. I perceive something through my lens of my education basis and all the things that I just mentioned, personality and how much I've slept. All of those inputs have a great impact on how I perceive something, but they're all going to be different than your or someone else's perceptions because their personality is different. How much education they have is different. Their sophistication level. All of these different inputs impact perception. How we perceive something then has a direct impact on the second part of processing, which is storage. So things are stored in our brains because of how we perceive things and what we perceive as important or not important. And of course, just as I mentioned, that's all different for everyone. And so the storage process is different. That's why I can say that everybody's rape is individual, not only in the sense that the circumstances of how someone is raped or sexually assaulted are different, but also how they perceive what happened and how they store what happened. The last part of memory is the action part. And the two main parts that I'm going to address here are survival and mating. The first and foremost goal and purpose of the brain is to survive. The second most important process is mating, so that we can keep the species perpetuating. Let's just talk about the survival aspect when we talk about trauma memory. Every memory that you have of your trauma is an action based on your brain striving to survive. If you survived your rape, your sexual assault, then your brain succeeded in getting you through that process. I next want to address some of the common sexual assault or rape responses. The first one that's probably most common is called dissociation. Dissociation can be described as a feeling of an out-of-body experience for some people. Other people describe it as a purposeful mindset of thinking about something other than what they're going through, so they'll think about what they have to do the next day. Anything other than the rape or sexual assault experience that's happening to them, and we call that dissociation. A second and very common response is tonic immobility. When a person encounters a threat, such as sexual assault or rape, the brain responds very quickly and automatically to survive. And one of the ways is to dissociate, but tonic immobility is another way. And while we've been taught that brain responds with either a fight or flight response, that's kind of misleading because what really happens first is the freeze aspect. Even if for just a split second, the brain freezes to kind of assess what's going on. After that assessment process, many people are taught that you'll go into the fight or flight response, but that's not always the case. There's a recent study that says 70% of sexual assault survivors reported that they had experienced tonic immobility for at least a portion of their sexual assault. Tonic immobility is defined as an unmoving, rigid response state to intense fear. And scientists believe that what happens is that the body enters tonic immobility when our brains assess that either fleeing, running, or resisting, the fight response, would increase the possibility of suffering or maybe even death. And this is a subconscious response. People who go into tonic immobility shouldn't be shamed or blamed for not doing anything while they were being raped or sexually assaulted because they had absolutely no choice in the matter. Paraphrasing what Dr. Jim Hopper says about tonic immobility, it entails neither consent nor cowardice. So tonic immobility is not evidence of resistance too insufficient to warrant our respect or compassion. It's a response that we should expect from brains that are dominated by the circuitry of fear. The other aspect of rape response, besides dissociation and then tonic immobility, is something called collapsed immobility. Some people think that it's a different type of tonic immobility, but in actuality, the physical responses of collapsed immobility are very different in that instead of tensing up and becoming rigid, the body goes very limp. And also cognitively, you might feel lightheaded, dizzy, or even to the point of possibly passing out. The reason I wanted to explain these different sexual assault and rape responses is that because of the intense reaction and orchestration of the brain to cope with fear and trauma responses of dissociation, tonic immobility, and collapsed immobility, you now have a better foundational understanding of why trauma memory is so affected and not very complete. Rape and sexual trauma affects the normal functions of the brain, and so memory is impaired. In the coming weeks, I'll describe more about trauma memory. But for now, the main points I want you to consider about sexual trauma memory are: number one, trauma overwhelms people's coping skills, and memory is a coping skill. Number two, Traumatic amnesia is a well-documented phenomena. Rape and sexual assault can cause traumatic amnesia. Number 3, traumatic amnesia can last for hours, days, weeks, or even a lifetime. Number 4, dissociation, tonic immobility, and collapsed immobility are all known to cause memory gaps. Number 5, victimization, helplessness, and betrayal in a sexual assault or rape increases the likelihood of dissociation, tonic immobility, and collapsed immobility. And number 6, all of these can cause sensory perception issues and memory problems, and your affective states, meaning how you think and behave. Hopefully, this provides you with some perspective on how trauma memory works and why you may have memory gaps in your rape or sexual assault experience, and why some memories just won't go away. This is all part of understanding the science of trauma. It's a science we need to know more of to discover the truth about our experience, because knowing the truth can reduce our fear and our biases. Thank you for joining me for this important topic of trauma memory. And don't forget to join me next week for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Please subscribe and click on the word follow on the podcast site. And of course, tell your friends and family about the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast. Finally, don't forget to do your part to bring justice to victims and survivors of sexual assault and rape. The best way to do that is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.